Everyone, and welcome. We're going to give people just a few more moments to log in, and we will be starting the webinar in just a moment. Hello, everyone. It is now 3 o'clock. Thank you so much and welcome to our webinar, What Cancer Patients Need to Know About the COVID-19 Vaccines. I am Dominique Bethia. I'm the Outreach Manager here at SHARE. Before the presentation begins, I would like to give you a little bit more information about SHARE. SHARE is a nonprofit organization that has been helping people through breast, ovarian, and uterine cancer for the last 45 years. Offering the support of those who have already been there. SHARE provides many services, including a helpline, support groups, and educational programs. All services at SHARE are free of charge to participants. For more information, please take the time to check out our website, sharecancersupport.org. We're asking that all participants remain muted during the presentation. Our guest, Dr. Hill, will be doing a brief overview of COVID-19 and the vaccine. And then after that, we will do our Q&A. You're welcome to submit questions during the presentation through the Q&A section, typically at the bottom of your screen. The chat section will be disabled. When asking your questions, remember that the presenter is unable to give specific medical advice, so please keep your question general in nature. There is also an option to listen to this webinar in Spanish. Please click Interpretation at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish if you would like to have this webinar translated. Thank you to the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center for providing this service, and thank you to our partner, Alicia, who is providing the Spanish interpretation for this session. Thank you for assisting us in increasing our accessibility to our Spanish-speaking community. This webinar is being recorded in English and Spanish and will be available on the SHARE website very soon. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Joshua Hill is an assistant professor at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center and the University of Washington. His research program is focused on clinical and translational studies to improve preventative and treatment strategies for infections in patients receiving hematopoietic cell transplantations, I'm sure he'll correct me on that, and CAR T-cell therapies. Dr. Hill trained in transplant infectious diseases at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center and epidemiology/biostatistics at the Harvard School of Public Health. He serves as an attending physician on the immunocompromised host infectious diseases service at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, Seattle Cancer Care Alliance, and University of Washington Medical Center. Dr. Hill, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Dom. You got it exactly right, so you did great there. Appreciate the introduction. And thanks again to SHARE and all the work that you do to support your community in these efforts and an educational outreach like this. So it's my absolute pleasure and privilege to have the opportunity to spend an hour with you all today to talk a little bit about what we know about the COVID-19 vaccines that are currently available and the ones that are in the pipeline, and how to think about it from the perspective of being a cancer patient, whether you have an active cancer that's being treated now or whether you've been treated 1 year ago or even 10 or 20 years ago. So I'm happy to talk about these different issues and questions as they come up. This will mainly be a session in which we're focusing on questions from the community and from the people that are listening here, because I think there are a lot, and hopefully they'll be broadly applicable to what people are wanting to know about. So I think the first big disclaimer to make in this conversation is that we basically have no data right now about the specific vaccines that are available for COVID-19 in patients with cancer. So that's the first comment. From the clinical trials that have been done, having an active cancer or an active condition that required therapies that suppress your immune system, those were exclusion criteria for the clinical trial, because we really wanted to initially understand how these vaccines work in a broader kind of more healthy population. So that's just the nature of how these trials were done. So we really don't know what the vaccine responses look like in cancer patients. That being said, we have lots of data about lots of other vaccines in cancer patients, and we've been doing this for decades now. So we've got a lot of other data from other contexts that we can use to understand and have a pretty good sense of what this would look like in patients with cancer, whether they previously had cancer or are getting therapy right now. So that's the one big disclaimer, is that we don't have specific data, but a lot of what I'll be talking about today is based on what we've learned in other contexts. So maybe just to briefly set the stage here to talk about what's currently available, what you might be hearing about from within your community or from your physicians, is that there are 2 vaccines that are currently given an emergency use approval by the FDA, which means they've made it available, but it's not officially formally FDA approved yet at this time, but they are being made available for people to get vaccinated. One of the vaccines is made by a company called Mrna. We're calling it the Mrna Vaccine. And the other vaccine is by a company named Pfizer, which we'll call the Pfizer vaccine. So those are the 2 vaccines that you could get access to, and some of you may have already been vaccinated with. And those are the vaccines that are currently being rolled out. And so what's interesting about these 2 vaccines is, first of all, the first 2 that have been approved now are actually extremely similar in the nature of what type of vaccine they are and the specific way that they work. But what's also unique about them is that there are no other commercially approved vaccines for anything else that work just like these vaccines. So they're unique in the way that they work for being approved, but they're also very similar to each other. So that's kind of interesting. These 2 vaccines are what we call mRNA vaccines. So that stands for messenger RNA. RNA is a component of our cellular makeup, kind of like our DNA, that is used to encode different proteins. And so what these vaccines are is essentially a small piece of genetic code that codes specifically for a part of the coronavirus that we're being exposed to right now. So it encodes a specific part of it that is good to stimulate our immune system to generate an immune response to, so that if we ever see the actual infectious complete virus, we would already have an immune response that's able to protect us from it. So specifically, the way that these vaccines work is that a way to think about it is that this genetic code that makes this part of the virus protein is put inside of a little, what's called a lipid capsule. It's kind of like a drop of oil, you can think about it. And so that kind of protects that genetic code. That is given to you into your arm intramuscularly. It's taken up by cells in that location, because that little oil droplet or lipid particle on the outside of it lets it bind and release that mRNA into the cell. And then your own cells will actually read that genetic code, make that one specific protein from the virus, which your cells sense as foreign or something that shouldn't be there. So they present that to the immune system, which then starts an antibody response. And so, normal other vaccines that we're typically given just give you the protein directly from whether it's tetanus or measles or mumps. That specifically, you get parts of the virus or a whole virus, and then your immune system responds to that. In this case, we're giving the code to make a part of the virus, and then you respond to it. So it's just it cuts a step out of the process there. So both of the vaccines work that way. One important thing to know about it is that messenger RNA, once it's released into your cell, it's very short-lived. So this has a very short lifespan in the body. It's rapidly broken up by enzymes within the body. So there's no way that it can linger. It doesn't integrate, or it doesn't affect your own DNA in any way, shape, or form. It's quickly destroyed by the cells. So there's no residual, toxins or anything like that left over by this. And there's really absolutely no way that this could affect your own DNA or your own genes or anything like that. So I think that's an important thing to understand that lots of people have questions about. So both vaccines are given in 2 different doses. So there's your initial dose and then a booster dose. There's no real magic in how they came up with those numbers other than what we know from other vaccines. And so the Pfizer vaccine is given a second dose 3 weeks after the first. The Mrna vaccine is given 4 weeks after the first. I know that there's been some vaccine shortages and delays around the country and getting access. So if your second shot for some reason is delayed, that's okay. I don't think that that would reduce your immune response at all. The key is to wait at least 3 to 4 weeks in between vaccines, but anything after that is still going to work just fine. So I don't have any concerns if you're delayed by a day or a week or 2 to 3 weeks or whatever it might be in between vaccine doses. So that should all be fine whenever you can get it. And then obviously the big questions are, when do we give this to people who might have active cancer and might be getting chemotherapy? And we don't know, as I mentioned. The main concern there is if you're on certain types of chemotherapy that suppress your immune system, it might also suppress your ability to make a very strong response or antibody response. So it might lower the total number of antibodies that you have in your system. How much it lowers that and how this varies by different types of chemotherapy and different types of cancers, that's stuff that we're working out now as these vaccines are given to more patients with cancer. Those studies are ongoing, and that's an important thing for us to know. But we know from other vaccines that the majority of people will still respond, and most people will have some response, and then it's just a matter of how big that response is. And even if you don't have a full response like someone that's healthy that's not getting any chemotherapy has, you're still likely to benefit from this vaccine. So it's similar to the flu vaccine. We always give the annual influenza vaccine to all of our patients undergoing cancer. We always offer it and encourage people to get it, because even if you don't have a complete response, we know that even a little bit of a response can prevent you from getting sicker if you actually still get flu despite getting the vaccine. We know that people that got the vaccine have less symptoms, less severity of symptoms, and overall have better outcomes. So even if you don't have a huge, robust response like a normal healthy person might, who's not getting chemotherapy or who doesn't have cancer, there's still a lot of potential benefits from getting this vaccine. So I think that's one key point to make. There's lots of other vaccines that are in the pipeline. The next one that's going to the FDA for consideration is a vaccine made by Johnson & Johnson. It has a similar type of mechanism or approach to the type of vaccine. And then there's a variety of other vaccines that are in different stages as well. And really just to say it up front from a high level is whatever vaccine you can get access to, I would get it. And I would take it basically whenever you can. Our understanding of this vaccine is that we don't think you would have any more side effects than anyone else that's been studied so far. So I don't think having cancer or getting chemotherapy changes the side effect profile of the vaccine. So we think it would be just as safe in someone with cancer as someone without cancer. So I think that's one point. We recommend getting it. And there's recent guidelines that have come out from different professional organizations that suggest that our recommendation is to do this. And the exact timing, is it in between chemotherapy cycles or when right before a chemotherapy cycle? We really don't know, and we wish we had enough data and flexibility to make those specific decisions. But for now, I think we're recommending that you get the vaccine whenever you can. And there's no reason to think that one of the vaccines will be better for you than another. So whatever vaccine is available and offered, I think is a reasonable option. So maybe that's a lot of information there up front. I thought I would just address some of kind of the big questions I think that are out there. And then I'd be happy to have Dominique take us through some of the other questions that we've received. And then towards the end of the session, we can take some live questions as well.
Thank you, Dr. Hill, for that. That answers a lot of the questions that we did have, but we have so many other good questions that people have put in the Q&A. So I would like to start with, the question is posed, does each person receive the same dose of vaccine, or is it personalized in some way, say by body weight, gender, age?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Right now it's standardized. So the vaccines that are out there, the two Moderna and Pfizer, are currently approved for adults aged 18 and older, and even as young as 16 have been studied in the trials. And the dose is standardized across people regardless of your weight or your gender or your underlying conditions. So that is all standardized. There are trials going on right now in pediatric patients and children, and likely the dose will be lower there. There are some medications that we do as weight-based medications and kind of personalize a bit. Typically for vaccines, that isn't done. So right now it is a standard dose.
Okay, great. Another question is something also that I have heard going around. The person posed the question, does a strong reaction to the vaccine, for example, having a high fever, headache, fatigue, mean that you have a stronger immune response?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't think I have specific data to answer that. You know, the intuitive answer to that is yes. We think that if you're having a response like that, it means that your body is having a good immune response. So that's clearly a sign that the vaccine is being active. And naturally, one would think that that means that you're going to generate a good antibody response. Whether or not that's entirely true, I don't know. But you know, if you were getting vaccinated with something that your immune system didn't respond to at all, you wouldn't be expected to have any symptoms. If I injected you with just saline or just water or something like that, you wouldn't have symptoms like that. So typically that means you're having a good antibody response, but you know, that's not something that you should necessarily rely on. But I think it's safe to assume that most people that get the vaccine are going to have a response, regardless of whether you have symptoms or not. And so the flip side of that is if you're not having any symptoms and you feel totally fine, I wouldn't be concerned that that means that it didn't work for you.
Okay, great. Another question that we have is, a person had wrote, I have read that these vaccines can have traces of SARS and HIV among heavy metals that can weaken a patient who has cancer.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up that question. I think that's a really important one that we should talk about and address. And so this is a concern and a question that's been around in you know, articles that you can find online and in various media and press, that's been around for decades, I would say, for any number of different vaccines that have been developed. And what I can categorically say up front for this vaccine and for all other vaccines that are in circulation right now is that that's not the case. And so there is no component of HIV in any way, shape, or form that's involved in any step of any process here for the manufacture of any of these vaccines. So that I can definitively take off the table. And that's the case for all vaccines. So there's no usage of HIV or parts of HIV in any of these vaccines. So that certainly is not a concern for this vaccine. And I know that, you know, there have been stories about this in the past and issues, but I can tell you that that's certainly not the case. And typically the FDA for most products that are released like this require screening for things like this as well and require all of those tests to be negative. So you know, all I would say there is that I can tell you that that's not the case, and hopefully you can take that to heart and feel reassured by that. The question about whether there's any SARS in this vaccine, and by SARS you mean the name of the coronavirus that we're talking about here. Yeah. So no, there's not. So there's the code, the genetic code that's used that will produce one part of that virus, of the SARS virus, essentially. But I think what the question is getting at is whether, can you get an infection? Can you get infected with coronavirus from this vaccine? And the answer to that also is no. So there are some vaccines that we use that are with live viruses. For instance, the measles vaccine is a live virus. And so we don't recommend that vaccine in patients that have a compromised immune system, a suppressed immune system, or who are getting chemotherapy, or who live with someone getting chemotherapy. So that is true for certain live virus vaccines. This virus that this vaccine that we're talking about right now, again, is just a single protein that cannot cause infection. So you can't get infected by it, and you can't give it to anyone, which is great. The other vaccines that are coming out are also just components or pieces of the virus that are not infectious. There may be some trials out there of some live but attenuated, meaning that they're reduced infectivity of the virus as part of a vaccine. I'm not aware of any of those though, so that's not something that I would be concerned about at this point. And then the other question about the heavy metals or trace metals that are potentially in the product formulation, and that's again something that's been highly scrutinized over the decades and has really been looked at very carefully by the FDA and different regulatory bodies, and those have been removed from all currently licensed vaccines that are out there for other pathogens as well. And certainly from these specific formulations, there are not those things. There are not heavy metals that could any way, shape, or form affect you. And again, we're talking about such tiny doses of 2 vaccines that are given that the exposure is minuscule, and there aren't those types of materials that would have any negative health effects. So I think those are all really important questions, and sometimes it's hard to sort out what's true and what's not from things that we see online or in the media, but I just would like to reassure everyone that I would not have those concerns with these vaccines.
Okay, this next question that we have kind of leads into it. Someone is asking, is a COVID vaccination able to trigger genes such as late onset Parkinson's or other types of genes like that?
Yeah, and so I briefly touched on this earlier kind of in my introductory comments about this. And I think more broadly, the question is, can the small genetic code that's as part of this vaccine somehow affect your own DNA or your own genetics, or how your body turns on or off certain genes that could potentially trigger something or worsen an underlying condition? And the thought there is no. I mean, certainly this, as I mentioned, it gets quickly destroyed within cells, so it doesn't persist. It doesn't actually interact at all with our DNA in our cells, in our body. It's really just read by different machinery, so it doesn't engage or interact with our own DNA in any way. So there's no reason to think that it would affect expression of genes or other parts of our own genetic code or DNA to prompt or trigger or affect any sort of underlying diseases. So yeah, my answer to that would be no.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
The next question we have is, how long before or after undergoing an invasive procedure should one wait to get vaccinated?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because life goes on and we have lots of other things happening. And so the general recommendation here is, if you're going to have surgery or some other major procedure, to give yourself a few days on either end, either before or after, before you get the vaccine. And mainly that's because you might have some side effects from the vaccine. You could have a low-grade fever, or you could feel poorly potentially. And so we just don't want to have that complicate your ability to go and get your procedure done, or interpreting whether there's complications from the procedure. So I would just give a window of about 72 hours on either end of that, either before or after, just to avoid kind of knowing what's what and what's contributing to different symptoms that you might be having. So that's one comment. And then as far as other vaccines that you might need or that might come up, the general recommendation here is to wait 2 weeks before getting another vaccine, to have at least 2 weeks between this vaccine and any other vaccine.
Okay, great. Another great question. Is there a white cell count you should have before taking the vaccine?
Right, and that's kind of a $1 million question there that we would like to know, is whether, at what point is your immune system thought to be ready to respond to this vaccine or not? And as I mentioned, unfortunately, we don't have that level of detailed knowledge yet with this vaccine, because it really hasn't been given to people that have low white blood cell counts. What I can say is that your total white blood cell count is not a great predictor of whether or not you'll respond to any given vaccine. And I think that'll be the same case with this. That's more of a marker of your overall kind of immune function, but it really doesn't predict very well. So even if you have a low white blood cell count, you might have a perfectly normal response to this vaccine. And we see that in some of our other cancer patients. And even for our other cancer patients with other vaccines, we don't have a threshold below which we say you can't get it, or above which we say you have to have a white blood cell count. So I don't think you necessarily need to worry about that. And our current recommendation is to take it anyway, regardless of what your white blood cell count is.
Okay, great. Now we have another $1 million question here. If you have had the virus already, should you take the vaccine?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's an important one. And the answer to that is yes. And that's definitely the guidance that we're giving to our patients and to the community, is that you should still get the vaccine. We're saying to wait, about 3 months or so to get the vaccine if you've been previously infected. But the reason for that is because what we've actually seen is that we can potentially improve upon, upon nature, which is amazing. That this vaccine can actually give you a better response than the natural infection can, and so that's important because we've seen now coming up as we've cared for more and more patients that people can get reinfected. Those have been well documented that people who previously got COVID-19 can develop it again, whether it's from a new strain or the same strain. That's being described now more and more. And so I would encourage people to still get the vaccine, even if you've previously been infected, because that will boost your response and give you additional protection, especially if there are new strains or other variants that are coming through. So I think that's still something that's important to do.
Okay, great. Another question we have is the second vaccine exactly the same as the first one? Same components, same amount of serum, is everything the same? Everything's
the same. And so for both vaccines right now, it's basically like a flu shot. It's actually a little bit less volume than you get with one flu shot. The needle gauge and everything is all the same. And it feels about the same when you get it. I can tell you that from experience. I've had both of my vaccines as well, and I did just fine with nothing but a little bit of a sore shoulder for a day, and that went away. The formulations are the same at both doses, so that doesn't differ. And one question that's been coming up is whether or not you can mix and match vaccines. Let's say that you got your first dose of the Mrna vaccine, but for whatever reason can't get the second dose. Hopefully that's not happening. It won't be happening. And so then can you supplement that with the Pfizer vaccine? And that's something that we're not recommending. The studies haven't been done that way. We really don't know what that would do. So that I would not recommend. I would wait until you can finish the series with the same type of vaccine that you got the first time.
Okay, we have another really great question. Someone says you had stated that it is okay to receive the second dose later than what is recommended. Is it okay to get it earlier?
Yeah, good question. And no, it's not recommended to get it earlier. So I would definitely wait the minimum duration of at least 3 weeks for the Pfizer and 4 weeks for the Mrna. So that I would do. I would wait that amount of time, and that gives your immune system enough time to establish the types of immune cells that are needed to really get that good boost. And so I would recommend waiting the full amount of time. Look, if you're a day early for some reason or 2 days early, I think there's no real magic there, and that's not a big concern if for whatever reason it needs to be scheduled that way. But ideally wait around 3 to 4 weeks before getting each of those vaccines as needed by the type of vaccine that you get. So I would err on the side of later than earlier, but if you can get it right on time, that's best.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so for our next question, we're going to change course a little bit with the questions. Someone posed the question, why does COVID-19 seem to have a more detrimental effect on certain populations?
Yeah, that's a big question and a complicated one that's, got a lot of different components to it, but a really important one that, we really need to think carefully about. So, what we've seen is that there are disparities in who is getting affected by COVID-19 and outcomes and how people are doing after getting affected with COVID-19. So we are seeing that in certain communities and groups and different, whether it's by socioeconomic status or by race, we do see differences in how people are doing. And there's lots of factors that go into play there. Part of it is based on the types of work that people do and whether or not they're able to socially distance and whether or not they're able to work remotely. So I think that's an important one. Part of it is based on how people's family structures, right? And whether you live in multi-generational households and your ability to isolate. And that's something that's not always so easy. It's easy for us to say, stay home, don't see people, isolate. But in reality, that's not possible for everyone. And we absolutely recognize that. And that's unfortunate that there isn't more equity there in what we see across our society. So that's that's a big part of it. And unfortunately, we also see disparities in the burden of comorbidities, so of underlying conditions, that certain communities have higher rates of high blood pressure or diabetes and these different other conditions, which are, there's complicated reasons for that. And so that leads to, if you do get COVID in that context, you can have worse outcomes. We know there's issues with access to care, right? So people's access to primary care, to preventative care, to just the healthcare system in general, there's disparities there as well. So some people that are getting COVID-19 might present later, whether that's due to cultural reasons or really just to access to care and the care that's available. I think presenting later and getting less aggressive care up front is contributing to this too. So these are really big ticket items that we need to address in the medical system in our society, in the US and more broadly. If there's a silver lining at all from COVID-19, it's that it's really brought this to the forefront in a way that perhaps it wasn't, or maybe it wasn't as visceral in the past. And so I think this has really uncovered that for us to understand more and be more aggressive in the policies that we make in this country and access to care that we have to help address some of these issues. So a little bit of a long-winded question for a complicated, or answer for a complicated question, but those are some thoughts.
Thank you. It's a very loaded question. And I want to thank everyone. There's such great questions in the chat. Now we want to get to, a lot of the survivors are asking really great questions. So the next question we have is, why should I, as a cancer patient, get the COVID-19 vaccine? What are some of the pros and what are some of the cons? Right,
yeah. And that's probably something I should have addressed up front, is what, not to scare anybody or anything to that effect, but what we know about COVID-19, and we do have lots of data and lots of studies that have been done now on people who have cancer who get COVID-19, is that there are more complications. And that's, not just the case for COVID-19. It's not unique to COVID-19. That's for other infections. We know that cancer patients have an increased risk of infection. That's my clinical practice and my research and what I do every day here at the Cancer Center. And that's why there are dedicated infectious disease physicians at cancer centers, because we deal with a lot of infections in our patients because your immune systems are lowered by the types of therapy that you get. So, patients with cancer are at increased risk for having more symptoms, higher rates of hospitalization. If you get COVID-19, it's possible that you can get infected with the virus more easily as well, just because you have less ability to fight it off from the outset. Plus, you've got more potentially, you need to leave the house more to get medical care, to access medical care. So perhaps there's more opportunities for exposure as well. So I think, to me, it's clear that if you get COVID-19 and you're a cancer patient, there's an increased chance that you could have complications. That doesn't mean you're going to. We know that in some cancer patients, there's a higher chance that you've got other underlying conditions that might be related to the chemotherapy that you got that maybe affected your kidneys or other problems. So those things all kind of goes together. So I think because of that, I think cancer patients should be prioritized for getting COVID-19, a vaccine that is, for getting the COVID-19 vaccine. And this is an argument that we've been making to the CDC, and we've written editorials about this, and are really pushing to bump the priority of patients with cancer, if you don't meet some of the other metrics, to get earlier access to the vaccine, because we think this is a relatively high risk, this is a high risk characteristic, and so you should qualify to get this vaccine earlier to reduce the chances that you have complications. So I really don't see any downsides to it. I think the vaccines are safe, I think they're effective, and I think they will be in cancer patients as well. So, it's a biased perspective, but it's not really biased because this is driven by what we've seen in the data, and I think this is based on what we've observed. So I would recommend that patients do get it. I don't think there's really any downside, and I think there's a lot to be gained, a lot of upside. The one other comment that I'll make that we always like to push is that you should really be focused on getting your immediate family, your immediate bubble of people vaccinated as well. So if your care providers, if your family members, if your spouse or your kids, whatever, can get access to the vaccine, that's critical, because they hopefully will also have good responses to the vaccine, and then really build that bubble of protection around you. So the more that you can do that, the better. So I think that's an important piece.
Wow, thank you so much. Okay. Dr. Hill, you okay? You're coming up for air. Thank you for answering all these questions.
Good questions. We're doing well here, I think.
Thank you, and thank you to all the people watching asking these wonderful questions. We have another question here. How long should I wait after the vaccination before resuming any cancer-related treatments?
I would say for that your cancer therapies are the priority. That's what you really need to be focused on. And so I don't think you need to delay. We don't have evidence that says that if you delay a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks that you're going to have a better, response to this vaccine. I think, if you're practicing all the appropriate public health measures of, maintaining, wearing your mask when you're out, social distancing, really just doing all the bread and butter things to prevent your exposure, not going out unless you need to. That's the most important piece here, and that's already going to reduce your risk to really low. Plus, if you get the vaccine, that's an added layer of protection. But of course, you need to continue doing all these kind of distancing and mask wearing and hygiene things that we're already doing. So getting the vaccine does not take that off the table. So if you're doing all of those things, ultimately your risk of getting this and having a complication are extremely low. So I would not put your cancer therapy on hold or alter your cycle or your schedule at all because of the vaccine. I think keep the rest of your healthcare maintenance in place and get the vaccine when you can.
Okay, so to take that to the next part of, it's another question, but it ties in. Do you know if there's anything about these vaccines that would encourage cancer to grow or spread?
Yeah, that's an important question that lots of people are worried about, and kind of similar to some of the other comments I've made about the type of vaccine and the fact that it's got this messenger RNA, this genetic code is, as I mentioned, it's unique, it's novel. We don't have other vaccines like this, and it opens up this whole other kind of concerns and questions about you're giving me RNA or DNA and genetic code, and how's that going to affect other aspects? And it's what I just want to kind of convey is that it's maybe scarier than it sounds because it really is something that's rapidly degraded by enzymes within your body and in your cell. It's recognized ultimately as foreign and gets broken down. The reason that the Pfizer vaccine and the Mrna vaccine, I'm sure many people have heard, is that they're very unstable. So they have to be frozen, right, at these really ultra low cold temperatures. They can only be stored for 10 days. The Modernas may be more stable. But that's because even when they're in this lipid nanoparticle, this kind of oil droplet, which is what allows them to persist, they're very unstable. And the second they come out of that and are in your body, their lifespan's literally seconds. So that's why they have to maintain them in these ultra low kind of cold conditions, is that it's a very unstable product. So it's not something that we think would in any way interact with your underlying cancer, or if you've previously had a history of cancer, there's no reason to think it would be more likely for it to recur because of that. So we don't have any reason to think there's an interaction with your underlying kind of cancer.
Okay, great. Is there a risk in taking the vaccine for a person that has a compromised immune system due to chemotherapy?
Great, yeah, thanks for that question. And really the only vaccines that we avoid in that context are the live vaccines or the live attenuated vaccines that are live but kind of slightly reduced in their infectivity. And those are things like the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. Some of the shingles or chickenpox vaccines in the past have been like that, and a few others. This vaccine is not live in any way, so there are no concerns about that. It doesn't increase your risk in any way, which is good. And many people are really excited about this type of vaccine, this mRNA vaccine. By having it approved for COVID-19, it's really opened the door for using this type of vaccine for lots of other vaccine preventable infections, and to perhaps replace some of our other vaccines that we've had for a long time with this type of technology, because it's really thought to be one of the safest out there, because you can't get infected from it. It's rapidly destroyed within your body, and it seems to be very effective. So that's the kind of one comment there, is that we think that this is one of the most safe vaccine platforms that we've ever had. The proof will be on the pudding. It's still early days, and we've vaccinated lots of people and we do feel very comfortable about the safety, but we still need to learn more about it. But I don't think there's any concerns if you're highly immunocompromised.
Okay. Yeah, there seems to be a lot of confusion about whether cancer patients could and should get the vaccine while they are in active treatment. Can you clarify just a little bit more about, that being an active treatment and the vaccine?
Yeah, I wish I could. So what I would say is that it kind of depends on any individual scenario. So if you are on a cycle of chemotherapy that's going to take a break for a few months, for instance, and you've got a few more weeks left, what I would recommend there is probably wait until that your cycle is done, and then get it after you've recovered your white blood cell counts or whatever a few weeks out from your chemotherapy. And that in that case, or if you're going to finish all of your chemotherapy for good in the next few weeks or a month, it might make sense then just to wait until you're done and then go and get your vaccine if you have that sort of flexibility. If you're off and on and in between cycles, we really don't know whether you're going to have less of a response if you get it before your chemo, during your chemo, after your chemo. I think that's really splitting hairs. And again, I would just get this as soon as you can. The sooner you get it, the better is my kind of perspective on that. So if it makes sense and there's a clear scenario in which you're going to be done soon and you can wait and get it, that makes sense. But otherwise, I would just get it.
Okay, great. Thank you. So for our next question, we're getting a little more specific. Is it true that the COVID vaccines contain ingredients that may attach to solid tumors, and what is the effect on dormant cancer?
Yeah, we sort of addressed this question a little bit in a prior question about how this might affect your underlying cancer. Do the components of this vaccine interact with cancer at all? They're injected in this lipid particle, which is just a non-specific particle that lets the vaccine particles bind to any cell, so it could bind to a tumor cell. If it was to happen to get into a tumor cell or to home for whatever reason to a tumor cell, there's no reason to suspect that it would rev up that activity or amplify that cell's replication to make the cancer worse or metastasize. So there really are no concerns about that. There's some theoretical ideas that it could go there, but we don't think that there's any clinical implications of that at all. So no, I would say we really don't have any concerns about that and are fully recommending this vaccine to people with solid tumors, with blood cancers and other types.
Okay. And we, for our next question, very good questions all, by the way. Why aren't high-risk patients who are under 65 being prioritized?
Yeah, the priority has been a very hot topic, and it's been a challenging thing for everyone to navigate. And even within states, this is being done differently. I don't know if that question is entirely accurate. There are, it just depends on where you are in the risk. So certainly, if you've got high risk features and you're above 65, you check two of the boxes. You've got a high risk characteristic and you've got the age, risk factor. And so certainly it makes sense to be vaccinating those individuals up front. But at least in our state, and I think this is also according to the CDC phases, that if you are younger than 65, but you have two or more high risk characteristics, like cancer is certainly one of them, you should be in a priority group to get this vaccine. And we are, advocating and making noise to the powers that be that if you have cancer, regardless of any other comorbidities, you should be prioritized into a high-risk group. We will do the best that we can to get that into the hands of the policy makers and to get that enacted. But most places with a cancer diagnosis, even if you're younger, you should be able to get some priority access. So, that's something we're continuing to advocate for.
Okay, so for our next question, is it true that people who had allergic reactions to, I hope I'm saying this right, paclitaxel or Taxotere should not get the vaccine?
Yeah, so those are two types of chemotherapy that are commonly used in some of the breast or ovarian or uterine cancers. And No, I don't think that there's a reason not to get this vaccine if you happen to have had an adverse reaction or an allergic reaction to one of those chemotherapies. Allergic reactions to those chemotherapies are pretty rare, and there is kind of a subtle distinction between an allergic reaction or other side effects that aren't necessarily an allergic or an immune-related reaction to the medication. Specific immune-related reactions to those medications is really quite rare. But I don't think that there's any specific overlap in the components of those chemotherapeutic agents and what's in this drug to make me concerned that you would be any higher risk for developing an allergic reaction. So I think the benefits outweigh any small theoretical risk there.
Okay. Another question that we have, how long does immunity last after having the vaccines?
Well, I think that, that question is actively being investigated now. These vaccines have not been around for very long, so you can kind of count on one or two hands how, the last person that got this vaccine in months wasn't that, or the first person that got one of these vaccines was not that long ago. So that's a question that we really don't know the answer to yet, but I think as time goes on, we'll start to understand that. But with influenza virus, for instance, the influenza vaccines, we typically see immunity lasting for 6 to 9 months, and then it starts to fade a little bit, and then that's why we reboost on an annual basis. The expectation here with the coronavirus vaccine is that it'll likely be at least that good, at least 6 to 12 months or 6 to 9 months in that range, and perhaps we'll have to boost this on an annual basis. We're hoping that it might turn out that it's more going to be every 3 years, and this might be affected by how fast the virus is mutating, if it does change, whether the current vaccines will fully protect against new strains of the virus or not. So it's a combination of how long does your own immunity last and what's going on with the viruses that are in circulation that kind of inform that answer. But for now, we think that at least 6 months to 12 months, you should have good antibody responses to the vaccine that you got, and hopefully longer.
Okay, wonderful. Is there any cancer research that is being done to use mRNA technology to treat cancer?
Yeah, that's a really great and interesting question. And so, the mRNA vaccine technology, although this is the first, approval for use more broadly in the population, it's not a new technology. It's been around for many years, for at least 5 to 10 years, and probably longer, that we've been using mRNA approaches similar to this for different studies. So it's been used in vaccines for other infections, like more obscure viral infections like dengue and malaria. So we've done these vaccine studies, nothing's approved, but it's been shown to be safe in those contexts too. So there is a history of safety in other contexts using these types of vaccines. And in the cancer field, there are mRNA vaccines that have been used to directly target cancer. So that is true, and that's an informed question from whoever posed that. And there's nothing approved that's commercially approved, but it is something that's been shown to be effective. So we'll see how that unfolds, but that's a good question.
Okay, great, thank you. So we have a few questions about the vaccine and PARP inhibitors. The first question is, what is the effect of the COVID-19 vaccine on cancer patients on PARP inhibitors?
Yeah, that's a pretty specific question to that specific type of therapy. That type of medication is something that prevents cells from repairing their DNA from natural, problems with the DNA. So it promotes cells to actually die in the cancerous cells, which is what you want to happen. I don't think that would have any interaction with this specific vaccine. If anything, the other chemotherapies that you're getting in combination with a drug like that might just reduce your immune system a bit, and maybe you wouldn't have as strong of a response to the vaccine, but I don't have any particular concerns there beyond kind of the general things that we're talking about.
Okay. The second part of the question was if the PARP inhibitor does effectively change the DNA, is it safe to add the vaccine that will affect my RNA? It was very specific.
Yeah, and just to reiterate there that this vaccine should not affect your DNA or RNA in any way. Yeah.
Okay. Our next, we had several questions about allergic reactions to Taxol, milk, eggs, etc., and that their effect with the vaccine. Do you know anything about?
And maybe the milk egg question comes from, like influenza vaccines are classically grown in egg-containing products, and so there's been concerns in the past. Although we typically don't have an issue given the flu vaccine, even if you have an egg allergy, now we still recommend it if you're in a higher risk group. And this product, and the beauty of the mRNA vaccines is that they're not grown in anything; they're synthetically made for the specific kind of product, and so there's a lot fewer moving parts, and there's less less other, materials or what's the term I'm looking for? There are fewer components of the vaccine, so there aren't egg products or dairy or milk products in this, so there's no concern there.
Okay. So our next question is, if you have an antibody response for 6 to 12 months that then declines, wouldn't your B cells be trained to fight it nevertheless and still therefore be helpful?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what that individual is getting at is there's been a lot of media coverage about antibodies waning or antibodies going down early after someone got infected or early after a vaccine. But that's totally normal and expected and not a sign that immunity is waning. And hopefully the right voices are getting out there to push back and say, we expect to see antibodies go down. That's actually something totally normal in biology. So that's how it works. You initially get a high response that comes down and kind of plateaus out. But the way that the immune system works is that you make these things called memory B cells that are circulating in your system and in your lymph nodes. And when you get re-exposed, if you got reinfected, those would rapidly be able to boost the number of antibodies that you have. So yeah, those memory B cells are expected to persist. And even if your antibodies go down and can't even be detected, there's the possibility that those can rapidly respond and protect you. So that's why getting this vaccine is important, and it will generate those memory B cells. So that's a good point.
Okay, great. The next question we had is in regards to immunotherapy. Is the vaccine recommended for people undergoing immunotherapy treatment for cancer?
Yes, it is. Immunotherapy kind of implies a specific type of cancer therapy using different types of drugs that might rev up your immune system, or giving you T cells or other things to treat your cancer. There have been concerns in the past with some immunotherapies that your immune system's already revved up, and if you give a vaccine, can that boost it even more and lead to some kind of autoimmune type of symptoms? Again, we don't know. It hasn't been given to people receiving immunotherapies, but we've studied other vaccines in these in that kind of context, and there hasn't really been a big concern that it increases the risk of having side effects from the immunotherapy. So we are recommending it in patients getting immunotherapy as well, and don't have particular reason to be concerned there.
Okay. Do we know what groups are at a higher risk for severe illness from COVID-19? And do we know what some of those long-term serious complications associated with COVID-19 are?
We do, and we've really learned a lot over the past year here, and we've learned very kind of clearly who are the high risk, what the high risk conditions are. Not to say that just because you fall into one of those categories, you're going to have a complication, because that's not true. But the way that the CDC has worked some of the priority schedules is really based on getting vaccines into people that do have those high risk features. So we know that age above 65 is a risk factor, but there are plenty of people that are 70, 80, 90 years old who have done just fine. We know that having heart disease, lung disease, kidney disease are definitely risk factors. Having a suppressed immune system is a risk factor. So these are some of the main risk factors that lead to having more complications. And when we talk about that, I still just want to just reassure people here that in the U.S., we're only seeing about 10% or so of people, if that, in that high risk group who require hospitalization. So still, the rate of needing to go to the hospital, even if you fall into one of those really high risk groups, is relatively low. And if you do happen to be unfortunate enough to have more severe symptoms and land in the hospital, the chance that someone dies from COVID among those people is also relatively low. So we've come a long way in being able to support people. We have new tools in our tool belt. So that's all good. And one of the great things that we found with almost all of the vaccine studies that have been out there is that even if you are one of the people that got infected, despite getting the vaccine, almost none of those people have required hospitalization. So basically this vaccine has turned, this deadly virus into something that might just be like the common cold. So that's the key point, is that, even if you still get infected despite getting the vaccine, it's still very important because it significantly reduces the chance that you have any complications from it. So that's really key.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have just a few more minutes left, so I'm going to try to get those last few questions in. So before we go, I want to
Did we just lose Dominique?
I think so.
Okay, I'll jump in with a couple of last questions. How long before the vaccine is effective?
Yeah, I saw that question pop up here in the sidebar and was going to try to work that in. I think that's an important one to answer. So what the trials have shown is that really about a week after your second dose is when you achieve that maximum kind of immune response that then persists. And that's how those trials were really designed. So about a week after you've gotten that second vaccine dose in, you're considered to be as protected as you're going to be. So that's good. Not to say that you should continue doing all of the standard measures of mask wearing and social distancing and physical distancing, but about a week after that second vaccine dose is when you hit that peak.
Okay. And our next question, any concerns about taking Tylenol or any general pain reliever after the second vaccine if you're experiencing side effects?
Yeah, great question. And that's a really important one and relevant one. So don't be afraid to treat, bad side effects if you've got them. If you're feeling, really poorly after you get that second vaccine or the first vaccine for that matter, because that can happen after the first. Just because you have problems after the first doesn't mean you're going to have symptoms after the second and vice versa. But if you have symptoms of fever or, you're just not feeling well, it's okay to take Tylenol. We're recommending that people do not take Tylenol just beforehand, as trying to prevent that from happening. That's theoretically could reduce your response to the vaccine. That hasn't been definitively shown for this or for other vaccines, but really what we say is if you happen to develop some side effects afterwards, it's okay to treat that with ibuprofen, Tylenol, etc. I think you're still on mute.
I was muted for a second. Sorry about that. Another great question, must you get the vaccine in your arm? Can you get it perhaps in your stomach? Women who had lymph nodes should not get the vaccine in the arm and that had their lymph nodes removed. It's a concern.
Yeah, that's a great concern, especially for this forum and this group. I think that's not uncommon for breast cancer patients to have lymph nodes that have been affected or removed or taken out or biopsied. So I would recommend that you avoid the side that was done on. If it was done on both arms or on both sides, I think you can get this vaccine anywhere. I don't know if the stomach's necessarily the right place to do it. I would probably do it in a thigh or in the buttocks as possible as well. So there's no magic to where it goes in necessarily, and it makes sense to avoid a side that you've had lymph node resections performed on.
Okay, and someone is asking, why have these vaccines not been FDA approved yet?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Good question.
It's extremely rigorous, metrics that have to be met in order to get final approval. And so some of the data that was brought to them was still not fully finalized, and there was some longer term follow-up that I believe the FDA wants to see, and they want to see longer term follow-up for side effects and for outcomes. So I think they're waiting on additional data. Sometimes the FDA likes to see 2 trials that show benefit, but really here final approval is expected, and I think it's a matter of really doing the full-on formal analysis of safety and efficacy. So that's to come, and I think they're still just getting all the data together, but there was certainly enough there to make us confident in recommending this to move forward. And there was representation from our institution and from colleagues of mine that were on that FDA review committee. So I feel very comfortable and confident in their conclusions to make these available as a vaccine for the population at large.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Dr. Hill, I want to thank you so much. It was a very informative program and you answered all of the questions. I want to thank everyone also for participating and submitting such wonderful questions. We're asking all the participants, please, please, please take a moment and fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. The survey will show up in your browser, so you don't have to do anything. It'll pop right up. And when the webinar ends, and the link will show up on the follow-up email. So again, thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone, for the great questions and your attention. And hopefully this was helpful.
Thanks, Dr. Hill. Thanks, Dominique.
Thanks.